Hello, and welcome to City Corner. I'm Josh Gilchrist with another edition of It's the Arts. Today we're at the studio of Hugh Millard, painter, who's going to tell us a little bit about his process and his work. Let's go inside.
My name is Hugh Millard. I'm a painter, and I've been painting since I was in my late teens in college, and have lived in New York all my life, and have been painting here steadily since the time I left college. My first interest in visual arts began when I lived in Italy for about 8 months before I went to college, and that time living in Rome was something that awakened an interest in me that I began to pursue a little bit more when I got to college. But it wasn't until my junior year at Yale that I was living with some students who were in the fine arts program and were painting in the apartment, and I saw them working, and I just loved what they were doing, and I decided I wanted to do that myself. And I enrolled in a beginning drawing class and was fortunate enough to have a wonderful teacher there who developed my interest and encouraged me to keep going after I left Yale. And so a year and a half after that, when I graduated, I was just very clear I wanted to make my life as a painter. I think it was the experience of watching people paint in an apartment, in a very kind of humble, small space, and watching the process of a space I had lived in and never considered to be what you might call the material for painting, being turned into something that was very interesting and exciting for me to look at. The painters who I fell in love with initially were French painters from the turn of the century, like Vuillard, who painted small, intimate interiors of his house, his mom, sewing. Bonnard, who made his whole career of especially working in interiors and transforming very simple and unadorned, spaces of a room, looking out through a window into something that was really an amazing subject matter. People like Matisse also, who painted the subject matter of windows, looking out of a window, over and over again, and made it a very profound subject. I decided to pursue studying at a place called the New York Studio School, which was a school where I could get more foundation in terms of drawing and painting from observation, which was the direction I wanted to follow myself. But I was really fascinated by the process of looking and painting and drawing what I saw, and the possibilities of creating imagery in a very strong traditional figurative framework that was interesting to me. That you could take drawings and paintings of street life or of a model, and then you could begin to synthesize images from that. And so there was a whole range of image making that was available to me that was not just about painting and drawing what I was looking at, but that material became the subject matter for more elaborate images, especially of urban life in New York. Downtown, I lived in Chinatown and Soho, and the visual landscape of the city and the street life was very, very interesting to me. And so that was where the experience of drawing and painting from the model, painting from observation became, the foundation for what I was making. I was renting a studio at different places around the city. I had way back, in the early 90s, had a studio over on 14th Street, 10th Avenue, and sometimes then I had a studio down in Tribeca for a while. And I was supporting myself, waiting tables and just doing the odd jobs that many people, pull together to support themselves and, sustain themselves. And it was a lot cheaper back then. and over the years, the imagery that I produced began to move away from focusing so much on the external part of my life, which was this, New York City street life and urban imagery, and it began to move more into the studio. And I spent a couple of years working on imagery that was really just about not quite still life, but a blend of interior and still life, especially focusing on windows, where I had, objects on a windowsill, and I was painting a relationship between the interior and the exterior, where the room and the cityscape outside were blended and kind of fused. Then I really moved away from that even and began to paint still life and objects in a very kind of quiet, enclosed setting. And when I had finished that cycle of work, I realized that I was exhausting for myself the possibilities of figurative painting. That I kept kind of pulling away from more and more identifiable objects and trying to even make still lives become something little less figurative, less identifiable. And at that point, I began experimenting with different approaches to abstract painting. When I realized I wanted to expand my process, expand the subject matter, and not just in terms of the imagery, but through the process and through what I felt a painting could be, instead of just a kind of a picture, I started painting abstractly. I started experimenting with materials, and I did that for a couple of years, and then I realized I was ready to maybe go to graduate school and really open my work up to the inspiration or the feedback of teachers who had a little more experience than I did. And so I chose to go to Boston University, where they have a fantastic program that really focused on painting, because that's the only thing I was interested in pursuing. And when I got there, I was very fortunate. I had a wonderful teacher there who helped me to experiment with how to take figurative imagery and break it apart in a certain sense and recombine it without making it be figurative. I studied with a painter named John Walker at Boston University. When I first got up to that program, I did what I knew how to do, which was made a whole cycle of work that was imagery of the interior of my studio, that was sort of some still life work. What I did was I began to cut up that work, which is something I'd never done before. That was an interesting move for me, where instead of trying to imagine how I could make something figurative not be figurative, I took the raw material of a figurative image and literally cut it up and took those different shapes and recombined them into other shapes that were sort of accumulated fragments of an observed experience that became not observed at all. It became the sort of abstract shapes that took on a life of their own, that had a meaning and a presence to them that was partly derived from their experience, derived from their being drawn from life, because there's a certain kind of specificity and fascination about a shape that's very specific from what you've seen. But it wasn't, you didn't look at it and say, oh, there's a flower, oh, there's a jar. So that was where the work that I showed at the SBM gallery a couple years later, that's where that work grew out of, was how to make imagery that was not kind of willfully abstract and removed from observed reality, but how to make work that wouldn't just present itself as a picture of the world. I was really more just cutting out shapes and literally combining them and not really making them works in their own right. They were. It was more like sort of cutouts, I think, is what I would call them. When I cut up that work and began to recombine it in my studio, I found things that I never really anticipated would happen. I wanted the viewer to see the world and have it be almost half observed and half unpredictably sort of created. From all the years I've spent working figuratively, I know the value of closely observed work where you find shapes and you find relationships in the visual field that you can't invent, you can't make them up. You know, you have to work from what you see, even if you're not painting directly what you see. And so that jump from making pictures of what I saw to making imagery out of what I saw was very important for me. It also liberated me in the sense of being able to reimagine materials, because once you break away from a pattern that you've used in the past, you know, a brush and a palette to make an image, and the work you saw was actually done painted more on the floor. I poured the paint and I used all sorts of different implements to shape it and to give it a certain feeling, and that immediately made me much more aware of the painting as a literal object too. It was, you know, it was a canvas, it was material, and that material aspect of the paint could come much more to the front, you know, when I wasn't concerned about making an image that would be recognizable. You know, that was not the thing that conditioned all of my choices. The most recent work I've made since that show I had at SBM was where I began to incorporate thicker texture with the paint, and trying to expand the range of the literal material nature of the paint on the surface, and also to push the nature of the shapes and the subject matter even more, to be even less identifiable and still more referential to the subject matter of the outside world, right? So the paintings you saw at SBM were, if you think of them as kind of right in the middle, sort of half abstract and half figurative. Now I'm trying to make those boundaries move away from each other, but still maintain the element of referring to the outside world, but being more material at the same time. The polarity is getting wider and has more tension to it. Is it just material, or is it image? The tension is greater. This is one of the more recent ones I've worked on, and the paintings I did right after my show were fairly monochromatic. They were blue and white. It just becomes very predetermined what the image is going to be, even if you start to distort it or change it. To me, it was, I began to be able to see the painting even before I made it, and I wasn't interested in that experience. I wanted the process of the painting to be a sense of discovery or finding things that when I came in the next morning, I didn't want to know what it would look like. I wanted to be sort of surprised by it being something different. Once I began to open up the process and work with different kinds of material, quality of the paint, once I began to let myself sometimes make a painting where it really just is a kind of random gesture that becomes the root for the painting, or sometimes a cutout, I just found that I began to have a much richer experience of the subject matter I was looking at. That by opening up the process and making it more less predetermined, I found a lot more richness and meaning in the imagery that I was making. Another element that I used in these more recent paintings is you can see how there are certain areas where the edges of the paint are quite sharp, and with these works I also began to use cut out pieces of paper on the canvas that I use as a kind of stencil for a shape, and then I pull it off so that when you see an edge like this where it's very sharp and clear, you can't really do that with your hand. You have to. It has a different quality to it. So that also increases the kind of variety of the way the shapes are made, and also the way paint that's poured, which is more out of control and just has its own kind of rhythm, whereas these shapes, which are made with a sharp edge like this, are much more precise, and they kind of give a different rhythm to the whole surface of the painting. So sometimes what I'll do is just take a piece of paper and put it down over the paint and pull it off, so that it kind of gives a stippled kind of textured quality that doesn't look at all natural. Looks quite just makes it almost look like the side of a building. These are actually quite, straightforward figurative paintings of the space. Paintings like this, where the idea was to find a sense of color that I could bring back into a more abstract kind of painting. So, for instance, if you look at this painting, and then you compare it to this more recent one here, you can see how some of the color of a painting like this begins to become the groundwork for a much more abstract image, where you wouldn't necessarily think of, a studio and interior space, but for me, in terms of a reference, as I'm making the painting, it's very much about how the ground of the painting is almost like the same color I invented for the wall of my studio when I was actually painting it from observation, or how how an image like this, which is a windowsill, or some people see it as a picture frame, but how it kind of relates to the color I might have found here for a painting when I was painting this from observation. I would not want them an abstract shape like that to feel like it was a one-to-one symbol relationship to something else. But right, but it is true that a shape like this in this painting functions as a kind of figure. It functions as a focus, that in the same way that a human figure would. Part of what makes a shape like this interesting is that it's not a geometric shape. It's not like a square or a triangle, but it also has enough variety in it that you start asking yourself, does it have a head-tail kind of relationship? Does it have a front back, and a shape that like this on the inside? Is that like a rose window, or is it a doorway? It has the presence of a figure, but it also has something else to it that is that's more mysterious. I might now try to make variations on it, where I would maybe close the circle and see how that would feel, or start to change the relationships of the edges and make it become something even more abstract or more figurative. Hard to say, but at least it's just a starting point, and so I could, as the association to it becomes stronger through painting it over time, you might begin to say it's going to change and go in a certain direction. I like this painting. This is an interesting one from the point of view of the opposite of tactile. The paint was so light, really almost like a watercolor, that it's always been a favorite of mine. It's interesting in the sense that you can kind of see how certain shapes become biomorphic. Like this becomes more of like a sort of serpentine or a dragon-like shape, and other shapes have more of a, they're both kind of circular and arabesque type shapes, but one has a much more anthropomorphic quality to it, and this one really just has a more kind of abstract kind of movement quality to it. What's interesting with these is that they're not at all related to a cutout shape like this. These were more just experimenting with the paint. I had a little cup of paint, and I just kind of made a shape and then let it sit overnight. When I came back in, that was the shape I had, and then I began to construct the painting from that perspective. Or a painting like this, where again there's not a central sort of cutout shape to it, but where I just found all kinds of interesting ways of using the material, the way the paint dried and settled this way. It gave a very nice feeling to the surface of the painting and to the translucency of that green. These images, these black and white images, these are obviously of the space of my studio, and it's a way for me to enter back into thinking about the kind of literal subject matter of the paintings. It's the way for me to kind of meditate on the experience of being in my studio, the experience of finding all kinds of interesting visual motifs that come out of very surprisingly, bare kind of environment. You know, the way just a sweater over the back of the chair begins to take on a very strong identity as a shape. You know, I could easily imagine cutting a shape like this out and then using that in a painting at some point. So it not only places me in terms of my studio and of the environment that I'm working in, but it also provides me with formal material that I could eventually sort of pull out of the context of the figurative setting and use in a different way. I'm very comfortable moving back and forth between abstract paintings and figurative paintings. I don't see the distinction really. For me, it's all the same subject matter, but just seen from different angles. For me, the studio has always just been a kind of happily messy kind of place where you just leave things lying around. But just that pile of stuff on the floor could easily become subject matter for a painting. So, but I do love this space, you know, and I love being, you know, I've had studios all over New York City, and this is just another part of the city that I have a studio, and it's a different kind of reference for me for the experience of growing up here and living here. It was just really interesting to me how these shapes, when you put them in a painting, they don't at all read literally, right? They look totally invented, kind of. But if you can find a shape and put it in the painting, then it really has a life of its own. What's meaningful to me is that those shapes are, you know, they're interesting in their own right, but they, when I look at them, I just see a kind of crushed together fragments of my own visual experience. I don't see, you know, a symbolic shape. I just see my own experience taken apart and reconstituted into something that's different than what literally it referred to. And I just love the way that gets, the meaning gets layered and buried so far in that the literal meaning of it becomes obscure. Like raw experience, unnamed or something like that. These are painted much more kind of gruffly and in a way more kind of figuratively, whereas the work where the paint was much more fluid became more unpredictable to me, and more interesting to paint because I couldn't predetermine what the imagery was going to be.
So I'm Anne. I own this painting. I love that it's in my apartment. It brings peace. I love the colors. I love the fact that it doesn't impose an imagery by representing an object.
I found a shape by just pouring the paint in a kind of random way, and I've used that in other pieces.
The colors are beautiful. It's intricate. It's very imaginative. It's very creative. So it's a very soothing and engaging piece.
Because when people came, they just saw the first stage. You know, it was just like literally one pass, and I was ready to kind of work on it again, but they said, don't touch it, we'll take it. And I was okay.
I'm not an art critic, but I just enjoy looking at it and feeling that it's there.
Since the show I had at SBM, that was mainly paint where I was painting on the floor. The paint was quite thin and in many layers of kind of watercolor type paint. Since then, I've tried to vary the surface of the painting more. Now I actually put some pretty thick paint on and use the paint quite thickly in some places, very thin in others, and I've tried to vary the surface of the painting. I always use oil paint. I use different kinds of mediums, traditional oil mediums of Stand Oil and Damar and Terps. If you have a medium, you have the actual medium, and then by how much pigment you mix into it, you get either a very translucent or a more opaque layer of paint. And depending on also the kind of pigment you're using, some pigments are very translucent no matter how thick they are. My time traveling in India, I went there on 2 long trips, that pushed me even further away from the impulse to paint figuratively. It pushed me more towards painting abstractly. Say the contrast of the highly imaginative and non-realistic nature of Indian painting and Indian sculpture was very, very interesting to me. And also because of my work in yoga, I have a certain sense of what some of that art refers to, and it's not something that you see. It's a whole different complex of ideas and of experiences that Indian art refers to, that also made me think about what it is I paint. You know, it's not that I want to paint like that or make imagery like that, but it just made it very clear to me how that art refers to something that is not even remotely sort of what you see. It's something that you feel, it's something that you experience in a much different level. Just think of them as they're objects of contemplation. They refer to the concrete nature of the outside world, but in a very oblique way that just makes them feel kind of real, not sort of invented and made up on a kind of a whim. You know, I want them to feel that way, but I don't want them to place you in time and location and become that specific. I want them to kind of release your mind and let your mind become more speculative, more introspective in the process of looking. You know, for me, the studio has always been kind of a refuge, a place to process and contemplate the rest of my life, my experience of the world. And so, if anything, I would just like people to have a contemplative tone, contemplative feeling when they look at the work. Even though if it's more agitated, it's more stimulating, I still would like people to have the sense that they're looking at something which is not pushing their attention to, you know, this place, this event, this person. It should be much more of a kind of metaphysical feeling.
I want to thank you for inviting us into that refuge, because this is where we are. We are in the studio where all the work is made.